Hey, Catholic Divas. How was your Valentine's Day? So many of us associate Valentine's Day as the love holiday, and a lot of it's focused on romantic love. But there are a lot of different kinds of love. And so it doesn't mean you have to be disappointed or frustrated if it wasn't a romantic holiday for you. And if you were frustrated this year, we've got some stuff to talk about to make it not so frustrating. So come on into the
Yeah,
podcast and let's talk about all the different kinds of love.
yeah. Welcome back, Catholic Divas. This is Mama Jane, and I want to give you a very quick acronym that we're going to be talking about today. It's called SPICE, S-P-I-C-E. And, remember that um, Christ told us that first of all, we need to love the Lord our God with all our strength, with all our mind, and with all our heart, and to love our neighbor as ourself. But the question is, how can we love our neighbor if we don't love ourselves? So we're going to talk a little bit about what SPICE is and how to practice self-love in a good and holy way through using SPICE, but also using SPICE as a little bit of a kind of a checkpoint of any kind of relationship, whether it's a romantic relationship, whether it's girlfriends, whether it's, siblings or roommates or however else you interact with others. So, so SPICE, S-P-I-C-E, the first letter S stands for spiritual. And we've talked a lot about on this podcast, as you know, the four real kind of spiritual practices I always recommend is Mark, Mass, adoration, rosary, and confession. So really kind of just on a scale from like 1 to 5, how would you say your spiritual life is? How is your relationship with the Lord? Are you going to Mass? Do you pray your rosary? Are you getting into the word? Are you spending time with Jesus in the adoration anytime? Um, and then as you go into relationships, this is one of the things I'm going to tell you. I love being Catholic. I mean, you and I, Vicky, have done this before. We had a great time in the summer where I think we've even talked about this in the podcast, but
Mhm.
I was visiting you and took you down to Kansas City to catch a train and we missed it. And so we like literally the whole afternoon we had available because the next transportation wasn't until like, I don't know, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And
Right.
so we were able to go. First, we went to have breakfast, which was
Hmm.
great.
We went
And
to
then
adoration and confession and mass. Yeah, it was great.
yeah, it was awesome. We just kind of did a Google and found a church and we saw that they had a noon mass. So we were like, well, let's just go to mass. And then we ended up when we got to the mass, we got there early and they were like, oh, there's confession. And they're like, oh, and there's, the priest came out with the Blessed Sacrament. So we had adoration and it was just really, really awesome. Well, so what is your perspective on the spiritual aspect of the first relationship?
Yeah, of course. We talked about this great day that we had, and sometimes you might find yourself, especially, we're still in the winter, and some places are still cold, and it's just kind of easy to get down this time of year and to become lax in your spiritual life, or to feel that maybe God's not listening. Um, and that could be a tough place to be. And like right now, seriously, right now we have about 10 inches of snow outside, so the thought of making it to mass or making it to adoration, it can be kind of overwhelming. And but God knows this, and He knows that we have times of weakness. So there's other ways. I mean, you can do things like um, listen to a podcast that's like Bible in a Year. You can turn on music that is kind of boost your spirits, and remember that you're not alone. You can make a phone call, you can call a friend, you can and it's important to do these things when you're feeling down, because it's easy to get kind of stuck in a rut, and then the further down you get, the harder it is to climb out. And at the end of the day, if you don't have your spiritual life in order, it's hard to get everything else in order.
Yeah,
So
yes.
I think
Oh my
it's very
goodness.
important.
I love that. If you're say that again, if your
If your
spiritual
spiritual life is not in order, it's hard to get everything else in order,
Yeah,
because
that's go on.
ultimately that's the relationship that's the most important, our relationship with the Lord.
Well,
So,
yeah, because
you
that's,
know,
I mean, that's ultimately our end goal, right? Like,
hmm.
Super Bowl just happened, and every year, every single team is, you know, their goal is to get to the Super Bowl every single year. And we just have to remember, as Catholic Christians, our goal, well, every single human being's really
Hmm.
goal is to get to heaven, to be
Right,
with Jesus perpetually, to have the beatitude. I mean, that is God's, you know, create the reason why he created us, is to
right.
have communion with us. So yeah. But then also, because God created us in a as a social being, because he is a communion, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, he desires each of us, not just, not just inwardly, like how is my own spiritual, but then also to help each other. And so that's what I was
Right.
saying. Like, I mean, and there's been many times you and I throughout the years have, been visiting and stuff. And it's just a kind of an easy aspect, right? Of like, hey,
Hmm.
let's go to mass together. And I know a young girl who she's just a beautiful soul. And she'll, whenever I see her, she tends to go to confession when another friend says, "Hey, let's go to confession."
Hmm.
And sometimes that is kind of an easier thing. I know when I talk to parents, when I'm in catechism and stuff, I, especially those kids who are going to make their first confession, I always remind them, like, take them out to get ice cream and celebrate that, because they've just been forgiven. Their so And even though, like, little 7, 8-year-old kids, they think those sins are like so big, and you're just kind of almost
Hmm.
laughing what they're confessing, but that means that they have a conscience.
Right.
And they feel so good after going to confession. So yeah, so that's one of those things that I want to encourage you to ask yourself, how is my relationship, how is my spiritual relationship with the other? And the other could be your husband, it could be your children, it could be your girlfriends, it could be a guy that you're starting to date. It could just be, if you're in a young adult ministry or a Newman Center or something like that. Or it could be your roommate, right? Um, that to me, for me, this is my own personal perspective, is that it gives me a very clear understanding of how the relationship's going to go, depending on how deep I can go spiritually, you know,
Sure.
and that's,
Well, and back to the confession, if you get young kids, if you start out and they feel like confession is a positive thing, it's not punitive, then that's going to lay the foundation for the rest of their life. So there's so many Catholics out there that think that confession is synonymous with punishment, and it is not that. It's exactly the opposite of that. It's to forgive. So, and there's just, I know many Catholics that don't go to confession because they're afraid, and that's not what God wants. You should have a respectful fear of doing things that God doesn't want us to do. But he's, again, we've touched on this, I think, every podcast. I mean, the only sin he can't forgive is the one you don't confess. So, lay that spiritual groundwork so you can feel uplifted, and then you'd have motivation for the rest. you know Physical, intellectual, creative, and emotional are the rest of spice. And if you're grounded and you're spiritually, you're going to be more motivated to work on the rest of this.
yes. And so let's talk about the P. So S is for spiritual, P is for physical. And it's good, we have bodies. We are mind, body, soul composite. I mean, the theology of the body is a good and holy thing. And so it's good to be physical. And again, that's one of those really great things. I mean, I remember when, like, back in the day when I was in the army, I mean, my husband and I, he's not an exercise guy because he's a tanker, but we would go run together because we had to pass PT tests and things like that. But that also creates a bond, right? Of, whether it's tennis, or whether it's soccer, or, you know, but and it doesn't even have to be kind of sports related. It could even just be, some kind of physical, going on a hike or something like that. Um, but there's a good and holy, our endorphins, right? The
Right.
legally
Well, God wants you to
blonde.
take care of your body. Right. Well, God wants you to take care of your body. He gave our bodies are a gift, whatever they look like, whatever shape they are, whatever we may have thoughts about them, they're still a gift. And if you can, however you can use your body, God wants you to keep it in the best shape it can be. Now, does that mean we all have to be like elite athletes? Of course not. And I also found that over the years, your physical, what you can do for your physical well-being changes over the years. When you're young, yeah, if you're in the army or single or you're in college, and what that looks like, you have the time on your hands to go to different classes and try different things. And usually, the younger you are, the more excited you are to try different things. And then, as you become a young mother, well, now you got a baby to bring along with you. So you got to get creative. You either need childcare or you need to exercise that, or I want to say a physical outlet, not necessarily exercise per se, but that includes your baby. So it could be maybe it is a class where they provide childcare, or maybe it's I know they've got a lot of different stroller groups that moms meet and walk. And I know that I am a person that likes to do things with others. So whenever I make a commitment to work out with somebody else, whether that's walking or actually working out or whatever, I am usually more successful. But COVID taught us all that that's not always an option either. And so I know, like, nowadays, there's just so many different ways to have access to classes or to stretching, different things to do on on the internet. On You can find things. You don't necessarily quote have to belong to a gym, or and then a lot of times those YouTube that can make you feel like you are with somebody, even if you're not. So the instructor just kind of feels like you're not alone. So there's just so many different opportunities, and there's a lot of things that are set up for 5 minutes. You don't have to.
Yes.
Many of us are like, oh gosh, I don't have the time. I mean, I can't. It's going to take 3 hours, and I don't have that.
Mhm,
Well, if you've got 10 minutes to stretch, that maybe your day that day, and it's
mhm,
okay. We're bombarded. This is the time of year where all the commercials are about fitness and diet, how to look better, be better, and it gets a little intimidating. And it's okay if you get that 5 minutes of stretching in, and that's all you could get that day. Then that's all
mhm.
right.
Or even just going out for a walk. I remember when my kids were little and we homeschooled, and the baby was first born, I throw him in the stroller, and everybody would get on their bikes, and we would bike around just the block. And
Yeah,
sometimes we would
walking.
go, depend, two times, three times, or sometimes we just would go to the park, and we would
Yes,
play chase or something with the kids.
walking in parks have saved my life over
Yeah,
the years, 100%.
that's right.
And when my kids were young, I used to say, I don't know anything to do in the city except that I lived in, except for where all the parks were.
That's
And
right.
so, yeah, we
Yeah.
we knew,
Mhm,
had the different things. So that definitely, and it gets you outside, and even in this weather, I mean, it's okay even in frigid weather. I mean, we got people that live in Fairbanks, Alaska, and it's cold there a lot. So you
that's
just
right.
learn how to adapt to your environment, or Miami, Florida, where it's still 85 and it's still hot. So
Yep.
wherever you are, you just kind of got to adapt to what you're doing. And
Mhm,
again, it doesn't mean you have to go on a 3 hour road march, but you could
mhm.
go on a 15, 20 minute walk.
Yeah, and again, it's talking about the relationships. I mean, one of the things, like, I have a couple of goddaughters that whenever we want to shoot, they want to get together with me. We usually tend to go for a walk. We just walk by the river and sit and talk. And I mean, that's what Jesus did, right? I mean, Jesus did that all the time. Now, of course, they didn't have all of the transportation we have. But it's a good and holy thing. Again, if you have a desire to get to know another person, this is a great, also, like I said, a great, area. Like, how do I have a physical relationship? And I'm not talking physical as in like a sexual relationship, but a physical relationship. And like I said, it may be like a basketball, game, or a soccer game, or whatever. Um, but I remember, actually, there is a funny story about that, is that there's one time when my husband and I, when we first got married, I was pregnant. I was like 8 months pregnant. We went down to another concern to visit a friend of his who came over from the States, and then he had to work. And so there really wasn't anything for us to do. So we went down to the rec center and we
Hmm.
just played games. we were kind of, and it was just really light. And because both of our jobs were so demanding, and literally we were just so tired all the time, it was very relaxing in that, it wasn't a physical aspect, but it was, and this kind of goes into that, other aspects, but playfulness is a really good aspect of, and again, playing games. I know so many missionaries like Net and Focus are really big on games, or youth ministry. They're really big on games. They'll play all kinds of different crazy games, physical, just to kind of get everyone kind of in the mood of like interacting with one another. And in this day and age, because like you said, COVID, everything shut down, a lot of times some of us have forgotten how to interact, which is why I wanted to talk about Spice. And
Well,
go on that.
yeah, I also think I think that you kind of touched on, we kind of jumped from physical to intellectual and creative with the aspect of game playing and
Mhm.
things like that, when you do things with other people, that usually stimulates your intellect, your thinking, and then games are always creative. Someone always has to come up with a new rule.
Right, right. Yeah. And so
So
that I is intellectual. And we have a brain. It's it's made to think. And how do we think? How do we go intellectual? How do we study or learn? Or
well,
and yeah.
on that note, I definitely want to say that can get a little overwhelming too. Like, oh my gosh, like I remember when my kids were young, reading quote intellectual books, that was kind of hard to do. Well, reading it all was hard to do. That wasn't children's books when they were all small.
Hmm.
And it could be, there's another podcast I listen to, and one of the things he suggests is reading 10 pages a day that pertains to you. Just 10 pages. Now that sounds overwhelming if reading's not your thing, but it doesn't have to be necessarily a hard book. It can be um, just a daily reader, something that stimulates thought and
Yeah.
focuses on, makes you think about yourself and maybe your surroundings and how to self improve.
Hmm.
And again, that can be motivating. When if you are in a winter area and you are home with small kids, these days can seem like weeks. I mean, the days are long,
Yes.
even though it gets dark early. So to always have like a little something for yourself is important.
Hmm. Hmm. And again, yeah, like you said, I mean, part of it is that again, it's the wellness, it's the self-love, and taking
Hmm.
care of our brains, learning new things. And depending on how we learn, like you said, some people aren't readers, some people would rather listen to a book on tape or something like that. Um, but somehow learning, even just watching a historical document movie or something like that. Those are really okay.
Over
Go on.
over the weekend, I had the opportunity to visit with my oldest son, and he's just a smart guy, and he started talking about Caesar and all so much. I mean, I know that I don't know a lot about Caesar. He does. And so I was like fascinated. I was like, oh my goodness, I didn't know all these little uh I'm like, how did you know all this? And he's like,
Yeah.
I just read sometimes. So, it's just, it doesn't necessarily, I could talk to my oldest son and learn something
Well, and
intellectual.
that's really that aspect, right? So it's like, again, we're kind of consuming, but then having those engaging those intellectual conversations with other people.
Hmm.
I remember a priest had told me one time, now this is back in the day when there were multiple priests, and there are some dioceses that have multiple priests in a parish. Unfortunately, in this day and age, a lot of dioceses they just don't. But this is, back in the day, um, the pastor, this guy was an associate pastor. The pastor made them at least like one day a week, and I don't remember what day it was, but one day a week, all of they had two associates and the pastor. They all had to sit down at dinner. Like they were not allowed to have any other kind of, they were not allowed to have any kind of meetings or anything. But the other aspect was is that they always had to have something to be reading, because you can't, as a priest, you can't like sit down at the table and say, hey, how was your day? You can't tell them like, oh, well, I heard confessions, and and so that was this priest's recommendation. He said you should always be reading a book, and then you have something to share at the table when you're talking to people. Now, this could backfire because I just happened to be reading like three different religious books, and this one particular person that was I was having dinner, and this one particular one, I was a group of women, and one gal was and I were just chit-chatting about this certain subject, and we were just going on, and it happened to be about the faith. And one of the other girls was like, you're excluding us because we don't know what you're talking about. I was like, okay, well, share with me what, because I went back to what this priest said. So what are you reading? And so she started talking to me about the novel she was reading, and da 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 and everything. And then she turned and she goes, so what are you reading? And of course, I was reading these three different books about this particular thing. And I'm like, oops, sorry. I'm sorry. So part of the intellectual is to expand. I remember a friend of mine used to always tell me that like she'd read like a little bit of parenting books, maybe a little
Hmm.
bit of religious, a little like a cookbook. A
Hmm.
cookbook is a really great intellectual thing too.
I love cookbooks. They're fantastic.
I do
And it
too.
gives you ideas. And that totally ties into creativity. We were talking about the C part of spice, which is creativity. And we kind of shared that, like, since I don't know, I don't have I can't quilt, and I'm not big into art and music. I mean, I can appreciate it, but I don't have the ability. But cooking, I'm very creative about, and I have been able to make something out of nothing more than once. And it's just really fun to read a cookbook and get suggestions. I mean, at this point, you and I have been cooking for big families for a lot of years. So it's riding a bike for us. We kind of go in the kitchen and we can almost always slap something together that the general populace will eat.
Right, right,
But it
right.
is fun and I know a lot of kids today, I mean, you just pop on the internet and you could get so many different recipes, but there's something about just looking through a cookbook.
Oh yeah.
Actually, when I was young, my mother-in-law, when I was a young mom, there used to be magazines, Taste of Home and Quick Cooking. Y'all, you'd have thought that it was my birthday, the days those came in the mail. I mean, I was just beyond excited to get these publications.
But yeah,
But you're trying to be creative and like, how am I going to feed this litter of children I have, and
yeah.
how am I going to make a budget work, and just the
Mm-hmm.
different things. And in the book, you don't get so overwhelmed. Sometimes I find if you Google tomato soup, I mean, you get 100 different recipes, and you're like, oh gosh, it's easy to go, well, which one do I try? And if you're looking at a book, there's not so many, and you can kind of use your own thinking skills and focus in on your talents.
Right, right. Yeah, and even like I agree with you. I mean, for years, I didn't think I had a creative bone in my body. And actually, another friend of mine, she was we lived on post, and there was a special. And a lot of times, the Protestants and Catholics have to do a lot of stuff together on post, and it happened to this
Mhm.
pastor's wife, and it was a creative thing, and I went really fearful, because I was like, I'm not creative. I just kept saying that I'm not creative, guys. I don't know what I'm doing. And finally she pulled me aside and she said, sweetheart, you are creative because you are made in the image and likeness of God, and God is the creator of all things. And I remember that was so powerful for me. That gave me permission to look for my creativity.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah,
And
that's a really good point. I think a lot of us need that permission to look for our own creativity, to believe that, yes, we have it in some way.
well,
So for
creating
sure,
this podcast was one of the things that I accepted, that I knew I'm called to do this. And it has been creative. I mean, a lot
yeah.
of the back stuff that we have to think about, of like the content, and where we're going with it and things like that. I mean, that is creative. Writing is very creative, and I know you're a very good writer as well. And
Mm.
that's but again, how do we develop the aspect of creating with one another?
Right. Well, that's, like you said, in relationships, I mean, definitely that's an important part of relationships. Like, how are you going to work through certain obstacles that come up, or even goals you set? It doesn't have to be an obstacle. It could be something you both want to do, and how you can get there. And a lot of times, the traditional route might not be the right route, but together you come up with an idea. And I thought about that too. Mothering, you do have to be creative. You set up one plan and then the weather changes or a kid gets sick, whatever. You do have to be creative in um, re reorganizing the original plan.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's
Well, and you're right. And even, even in the home, right? Even in the
mhm.
homemaking of, remodeling a home or redecorating a home for seasons. You're really, really good at that. You and your mom are both very, very good at that. I don't really, I haven't acquired, or I haven't taken the time. I've just not chosen to take the time to really get into the decorating in the seasons. I think part of it also is because I live in the Southwest, and it's pretty much this. I mean, even though, the fall and things like that, but you guys are really, really good about that. And that is a creative avenue as well,
That's
you
true.
know. And
Thanks. I was
no,
thinking of
and
creative when I had my four boys, and two were especially close, and they were just a disaster at the dinner table. I mean, I would just be so frustrated because so I had to be creative in how to strategically place these children so the mess was kind of contained, and I figured out putting a sheet underneath their high chairs. It's just funny. That was just a little
yeah,
memory I have.
yeah.
So at the
We
time, I wouldn't have said, "Wow, I'm so creative. I came up with this."
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's the thing,
No.
is that's what I'm saying, is that we don't give ourselves enough credit that on the creative aspects that we are as women. I mean, as women, we are co-creators. That this is our
Hmm.
gift to the world, is to be creative. And I know nowadays a lot of people, there's those the adult coloring books, and those are
Yeah,
so soothing and
they are.
so, maybe you don't draw the actual picture yourself, but you and I and somebody else could have the same picture, and the colors that we
Color
choose,
scheme. Yep.
and that is so creative. And that kind of goes into the last letter is emotional, right? Our emotional
Hmm.
well-being. And I know for many, I have a lot of friends whose therapists have recommended, I don't even know what they're called, they're adult coloring books, but they have specific
Hmm. Messages or
pages.
whatever.
Yes,
Pages.
and
Hmm.
and it gives them the opportunity to calm themselves down and
Yes.
to really process their emotions.
I laugh because at the hospital they have sometimes they'll have in the break room a big giant color by number, or not color by number but adult
Mhm.
coloring thing, and colored pencils for I guess for us nurses to go in and calm down, regulate ourselves.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
just think it's funny,
absolutely.
but
Well,
it also is kind of curious and neat to see the different sections that different people take, and it's kind of a team building thing in a way. It turns out to be. So that you're right. That's interesting. But yeah, emotions can be a lot. Emotions can be a lot, and emotions can toy with all the other things we've already tackled: spiritual, physical, intellectual, creativity. If your emotions aren't in check, and I definitely learned from you that an emotion, the tidbit, the fact that emotions only last 90 seconds, right? That's just
yes,
that's and
yes.
so
Isn't that
and
amazing?
so it is, because they can seem so overwhelming, and I think it's a very powerful tool just to know that. So if you can hang on to nothing else, whatever strong emotion you're feeling, if you're like, okay, this is just an emotion, and this too shall pass, and I can use my brain to think through this. Just let me ride this wave, and it's going to be done. Kind of like getting into a contraction. Big
Yeah.
breath in, and just breathe through it. It's going to end. It is going to come down on the other side, because
Hmm.
I know for sure. I mean, the very first time that I heard that you didn't operate, like people didn't have to operate only on their emotions, I was like, wait, what? Isn't that how people operate?
Well, that's, it's one of the reasons why I love being a Catholic coach, because that is one of the main things that I teach clients, is how do we manage our emotions? And, St. Thomas Aquinas talks about antecedent emotions and consequential emotions. Antecedent emotions are just that. They're the emotions that we just, it's almost like a knee-jerk reaction, right? We
Hmm.
don't process it. We immediately react, and then we deal with the consequences afterwards. But the truth of the matter is that the Catechism of the Catholic Church talks about our emotions are part of our body. They're neither morally good or evil. What they're there for is to draw us either closer towards the good or help us to be aware and run away from the evil. And
Hmm.
unfortunately, so the antecedent emotions, those are like the unprocessed emotions. We're going to react, boom, that knee-jerk reaction. But Thomas Aquinas talks about, and this is what Catholic coaching mindset coaching does, is we teach how do we process those emotions through what we call the reason cycle, through our intellect. So then we have consequential emotions. And these are the emotions that like, is this the emotion I desire to feel and to think about? Because remember, the emotion and the feeling are connected. And
Hmm.
that's why it's that 90 seconds. And that's really a good thing of like, I'm having this really strong emotion. The first thing I remind people is, what are you thinking right now? Because
Hmm.
then you can see the connection, and then you can see the willpower, like this isn't a good and holy thought, or maybe it might be, depending on the situation, because
Right. And
emotions can serve us, and it's telling us things, anger can tell us that there is an injustice. That is the purpose of anger, that there has been an injustice, but there's also sorrow in that injustice. So it gives us the opportunity to be merciful. And and same thing with fear. Like, fear can warn us that there is danger, that there is evil. But
right.
unfortunately, we don't take the time, like Thomas Aquinas says, take the time to take it through the logic. Is this really a fearful thing, or is it just my brain telling me that it might be fearful? And
Right. Well, that's why I will make a plug for the Catholic coaching, because that definitely, even if you don't have to dive all the way in. You don't have to be, oh gosh, I have this thought. It's going to take an hour and a half. I'm going to process this. No, it's very simple. Just sometimes when you think and you're like, okay, what if this thought is fact? You know, does like
Mhm.
whatever. I think my husband's mad at me. So I'm like, okay, my husband hates me. I mean, that's a little extreme. He probably doesn't hate me. We're married. So I'm like, okay, well, whatever, it is, you can break it back down and like, and maybe sometimes when you think your partner is mad at you, it doesn't even have anything to do with you. He's not mad. He forgot something he was supposed to take to work, or, whatever. His shoe got wet walking out to the truck. I mean, you just don't know. And
Right.
so if you take a moment to break it down and be like, all right, what is the true concern here, or the true, what is
Mhm.
fact and what is
Mhm.
not fact, and then that can help you, that can diffuse strong emotions right there.
That exactly. That is so wonderful. So that's one of those things that we would encourage you, audience, to take, just
Hmm.
discerning for a moment. Is this fact? Facts are boring. Facts are that it is what it is. A fact is a fact. Or is it an interpretation or a judgment
Hmm.
or a perception of something that happened? And that is such a great, I'm going to tell you that did shift me as well when I started discerning, like, what is fact and what is not fact. What
Hmm.
is just a thought of something. And that whole thing, and again, that's Thomas Aquinas. That's using our intellect, helping us, you know, manage the emotions. So, but also the other thing is, going back to our relationships, if there is a very strong emotion, it does benefit to be able to share that emotion with the other in
Hmm.
a way that I'm not overwhelming you with that emotion, but the compassion, because compassion literally means with emotion.
Hmm.
And so then you can share the emotion. And that's another thing that Catholic coaching has really helped me as a person, but also as a coach. That's what I help create the space. And it's not that I take on the person's emotion, is that I recognize and I hear their emotion. And sometimes that's
Hmm.
all we need, is someone
Right.
else to hear and acknowledge, I am feeling this feeling at this moment, instead of saying, well, don't feel that way. Don't feel, and we put it away or something. That is true compassion. And that's true love, because then you're recognizing the human being at the moment that is in front of you and saying, this is where they're at this moment. How can I serve you?
Hmm.
without having to take it on. And that's the other aspect of it. Like, I don't have to take on your emotion, but I can walk with you in this emotion.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I hope this was really good for you guys. Spice, spiritual, physical, intellectual, creative, and emotional. So you can use that spice developing your own self, and like, how do you love yourself? How are you growing in these areas? And having a relationship, it doesn't matter. Like, with Vicky, with Mama Vicky and I, we have a relationship, and each of those areas we we are growing together, and it just makes that relationship deeper and deeper, right?
Hmm. Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. So
I,
we hope this was good for you guys. Please, we'd love to hear your feedback if you have any comments, or how if one of those areas you've never contemplated about, or you know, how you use one of those areas in developing your own friendships, your own relationships, whether, like I said, it's the roommate, or your children, or your, you know, beloved, or your girlfriends, or with God.
yes.
And until next week, we will see you.
Yes. Have a good week. Bye.